got it.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Well, hello to you and hello to the viewers. My name is Michael Dandrea. I'm the Executive Director for the National Institute for Multicultural Competence and the founder of the Social Justice Creation website and video collection we're developing, focusing in on a broad range of issues related to professionals in the mental health fields. Today, we're delighted to have an opportunity to work with a colleague and a friend and colleague for over 4 decades, has invested time and energy in many different areas, Professor Emeritus at the Arizona State University, uniquely situated in working within the mental health professions in counseling and counseling psychology in various areas, holding leadership positions for decades, having a wonderful best-selling book At Risk Youth, that is in its 5th edition, moving to its 6th edition with a lot of technological resources going, something that we'd strongly recommend interested viewers to check out. One of the unique things, besides your professional experiences, credentials, and respectability across the nation, is your family system. And you have a tightly formed, special family system that we'd love to see replicated. And your son, Ben McWhirter, and his wife, Ellen Holly McWhirter, are both at the University of Oregon doing tremendous work in counseling psychology with a real centerpiece on multicultural and social justice issues. Another daughter at Oklahoma University, doing wonderful work, pace-setting work, looking at the issue of intimate partner violence with a focus in on how kids get affected by witnessing intimate partner violence. I should also add that Ben and Ellen at Oregon have worked together on pace-setting information and publications on career development, looking at it from a social justice perspective. And Ellen's work in empowerment counseling, who has been supported by Ben, is a real important contribution. We're delighted to have you here today.
Good to see you, Michael.
Good to see you. Always, always great to see you. We're going to focus in on the notion of at-risk youth. And I know you have an interesting take on at-risk youth. Can you talk a little bit about how you've used that term in the past and how some people have reacted to it?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. We did a lot of work with inner city schools at various points in time, and one particular school in Phoenix is the traditional African American school. It started off about the time that Brown versus Topeka happened, but it was a place that African American families continued to send their kids. So when we went to propose, I'd gotten a grant that the school I was going to work in didn't want us anymore for a variety of reasons. So we were shopping this grant with a good bit of money that came through the university. And so we went to meet with the school board, and the issue that the parents raised was at risk implies that you're blaming our kids for everything. And I'm really sensitive to that. One has to be careful about how you use that term, because in many ways, while the kid at certain points in time end up developing behaviors that do continue to put them at risk, before that ever happens, the community is at risk because of the circumstances that they're in, or the school causes the at-risk problem. And once we explained it to the parents that way, they were able to see our point of view and saw what we were doing might be helpful to their kids.
That's a significant change in the construction that many counselor educators and practitioners operate from. But once we look at the community at risk, the family at risk, the school at risk, it certainly broadens the roles and responsibilities that we have as professionals.
No, it's true. And it actually fits right in with the work that you and other people have done with multicultural issues, because it looks more at a community notion instead of an individual notion, instead of focusing on the individual, although of course you have to do that. But the individual is a part of a much broader thing, and we cover that in our book as well.
And your book really leads me, upon reading it for a number of classes, looks at the counselor not only being a change agent for the individual, but really being a change agent to facilitate and support changes in the family, in the school,
Yes.
in the broader community.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
seems to be a mindset of the 21st century counselor, mental health professional, although your work has certainly been 20th century and pace setting in that regard.
Yeah.
You know, you use a continuum
Yes.
of at-risk. I'm
Yeah.
really interested in
Yeah,
hearing
so
that and learning
rather
more
than
about it.
talking about at-risk as a thing that happens here, and that's the way kids are, you have to, I think you really need to think about it as a continuum. And we anchor the lower one end of the continuum as minimal risk. We don't anchor it as no risk because in many ways, regardless of the circumstances, everybody's at risk in this society. And in fact, when we were getting this set up, there was a gentleman in here that was willing to step out and let us do this filming, and he talked about him being at risk. And then he talked about coming from a wealthy family with 2 parents and a father that's a minister, and yet he was at risk. Because that happens to almost everyone. You have that potential. Families with money lose their money. Couples that are getting along end up getting divorced, and that adds to the environment that creates that risk. So from that end of minimal risk to really severe risk, where at this point the young person, in the way we define it, is actually doing behavior that is actually the target behavior. So the kid is already doing drugs, for example. Well, is he at risk? Well, he's at risk still for other problems. So kids that do drugs drop out. Kids that do drugs have risky sex. So even though he's already doing the behavior of one category, there are other categories that he is at risk at. So it really is along a continuum. Money is a part of it, but not the big part. It's personal relationships with people. Mm-hmm. So it helps frame things, I think, and that helps some prevention and treatment, because one of the things about at risk, the things we like it, is that you think then it gets you thinking along the way that at risk is a future issue, which gets us right into the prevention work that both you and I have done.
Yes.
So you think about doing an intervention here to stop a future problem.
Yes.
You're dealing with an at-risk here for a future problem.
Yes.
So it really ties into the prevention literature.
And you just mentioned the man that was here and very generously decided to leave to let us do this video. And it was interesting. He was a white man.
Yeah.
And he talked about the resources he had.
Yeah.
And those resources with the minister father and other family members were something that were positive in his life as he was dealing with at-risk issues.
Yeah.
And then he quickly mentioned, he said, with all of the support I had, I often think, what is it like to be an African-American woman raising children by herself with not much money?
Yeah.
I just think it must be an overwhelming, and we both kind of congratulated him or said, hey, thanks for bringing up that issue and that sensitivity.
That's right.
And that fits into your continuum idea very nicely. You have 5 categories. I think it's 5 categories of at-risk issues that you look at in your book.
Well, let me just change the language a little.
Sure.
We've got these 5, basically 5 demarkers of the continuum, and then we focus on 5 specific clusters of behavior.
That's right.
So it's dropout. There's a chapter related to dropout and other learning kinds of problems. There's a section that deals with substance use and abuse. There's a section that deals with risky sex. There's a section that deals with youth suicide. And there's a section that deals with other kinds of violence that kids do to themselves and to others.
And you said earlier that any one of those clusters or categories really can then complement and expand the risk behaviors and ways of being in other of those clusters.
Yeah. We have a huge amount of data that we have in this area where it's correlational. You end up with kids and you try to say, well, the kid is doing drugs, therefore he's having risky sex. Well, maybe there's a cause and effect there, but it's certainly the data, most of the data we have is basically it's correlational. It happens at the same time. There's obviously some kind of interaction, but we're still trying to tease all that out.
You know, and I appreciate what you just said, because I'm familiar with not just your book, but your journal publications, many of which are empirically testing the interventions that you talk about. So with the increasing attention on empirically supported therapies or interventions, I really appreciate how early on you started to demonstrate empirically
Yeah.
where things were successful and where things were not successful. Now, one of the things, we have a continuum, we have a set of clusters. As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, wow, there's a roadmap, those 5 clusters, for a comprehensive prevention, wellness, health program that counselors can implement in the schools.
Yeah.
But what else, very practically, would you share with students and counselors who are entering the field, working in schools in particular?
Yeah.
But we're mindful that school counselors often partner with community agency counselors as a team. But let's focus in on the school. What are some of the practical things that you have found useful that the viewership may consider implementing?
Yeah. Well, start with your building. We've found, I think I mentioned this to you, we found that if we train counselors and give them certain kinds of skills, relationship skills, prevention programming, all sorts of things, and they know what to do, if they find a building principal, the decision maker in the school, in the setting, who's willing to let them do that, they can really do good counseling. A lot of times building principals simply don't see the value or don't understand, or they work with a group of counselors that haven't been particularly well trained. So they get locked into a box of using this highly expensive, given a thing, to do things like scheduling, which in a huge, it's a clerical task. And that's a huge amount of money to spend for clerical tasks that you don't have to have that kind of training to do it. But you got to have counselors that know something to do. And so the first thing, if anybody's looking for a job, talk to the building principal and see if he'll let you do the stuff that you know
Now,
how to
if the building principal is someone who is an advocate and supporter of addressing the 5 clusters that you talked about, the door opens wide.
Yes.
And then it becomes a task of working to organize with colleagues and teachers and parents to implement this broad-based program.
Yeah.
But then you mentioned this other group of administrators who may simply lack the knowledge but have a good heart, that are willing to try things that sound reasonable, that can be supported by data, that may be supported by state or federal funding.
Yeah.
That takes a different set of skills to serve as an advocate,
Yes.
I'd refer to.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you find it important to communicate to students at Arizona State University or in your consultation to deal with that situation?
Well, one is to think outside the box. So many of our folks, so much of our training is based on these little, sitting in your little office, bringing kids in to talk to you, or bringing parents in to talk to you, with much less attention to getting out and seeing the kids out where they are, getting out to this. Years ago, I was involved in visiting the kids. I had a group of 50 kids that we identified as educationally disadvantaged. They'd be called at risk now. And I met all the kids the first week of school to talk to them, and then I sat there for 2 weeks and nobody came to see me. And I thought, this ain't gonna work. And I have 50 kids, they're a specialized group. So I found out where they went at noon and before school and after school, and it was a place called the Pit. It was between the school property and a neighboring road, there was an easement. And all of my kids were out there smoking and talking.
So what'd you do?
I went out to see them.
And how were you received?
School. Well, initially I heard a lot of language. I'd heard the language before, but I heard a lot of language. But obviously I'm not there to correct them. So I just sat and listened, and pretty soon that that's slowed down. I ended up meeting with the kids out there before school. We had 3 lunch periods, so 3 lunch periods, and then after school. If I couldn't find a kid in class, I go out to the Pit because they were ditching out in that class, right? They were ditching class to go to the Pit. So eventually, they formed sort of informal groups, except the Pit was also an attraction for kids that were leaving their Pit at the neighboring high school and coming over. So the population kept changing.
That's interesting.
And so I ended up actually taking the groups of kids that we tended to get into the school building and having formal groups. So I just found, this is too confusing, it's too chaotic. I got to get someplace where we can set up group norms and meet in the building. I did. Now the problem with that, actually, as I look back on it now, is that I had all kids that all had the same kind of value system, and they saw nothing wrong with cutting tires. It would just, and there is evidence to suggest getting hostile, angry kids together in a group alone is a bad thing to do because they reinforce each other. So if I were going to redo that, I would probably put in some kids that saw there was something wrong with cutting tires, slashing tires.
Now, in the work that I have shared with you in the past is we look at developmental stages, and we refer to people who are pacers to be valuable in group settings. And a pacer are individuals who are operating from more complex cognitive, moral, social reasoning,
Yeah.
so that they can provide alternative perspectives. And I guess the term of dissidence, a dissidence creator,
Yeah.
is someone. So for the viewers that are listening, I think you're making an important point here. If you have a group and everyone in the group shares the same values that are not necessarily positive,
Yeah.
that the whole idea of recruiting additional members who provide a higher order of thinking,
Yeah.
but are cool, they're part of,
Yeah.
accepted in
Yeah.
that way. You give new meaning by going to the pit to a phrase which I think a lot of people have ambiguous interpretation, which is, we need to meet our clients where they're at.
Yeah.
And you literally move yourself out of the office to meet them where they're at, and it sounds like it led to
Yeah.
more buy-in, more potential change.
And then I would
going
have
on.
kids that would come to see me. I would have kids in the pit that would bring their friends in to see me,
Mhm.
because I became recognized as somebody kids could talk to. And there are a lot of counselors where kids could talk to them, but the kids don't know that if they're sitting in their office.
And I understand from your past in high school yourself, you were quite the basketball player. And I find myself shooting baskets with kids
Yeah.
in the playground. They spend so much time there, and I found that when I would say it's time for counseling, come on in,
Yeah.
the face would drop, the cursing would start, and so I said, we got to change that, and we're going to stay out here. And they would
That's right.
really open up in doing that. So we're
Yeah.
providing some alternative ways of dealing with this. And you've talked about the administrator, we've mentioned the teachers and the parents as important stakeholders. What about the rest of the community?
Yeah.
What roles do they play?
Well, if you can engage the churches that you've talked about and written extensively about, people out in the community, they're perceived to be connected. The fellow that was in here probably would be the kind of person you want. What's the Japanese, at least I heard the expression, I think when I was teaching in your program here in Hawaii a few years ago, the Japanese have an expression of having a counseling heart.
Yes.
That's a really great concept,
Yeah.
because technically we would do a better job of training counselors if we could figure out who has a counseling heart before they ever get to us, because many of them do, because they're attracted to our field. But there are a lot of people that are not counselors that have a counseling heart, and those we need to probably identify.
And many people in the communities do.
Yeah.
And when we talk about issues confronting challenges our youth, the Cornell West has written extensively about this concept of nihilism.
Yeah.
And nihilism is a feeling of being powerless, being helpless, of
Yeah.
having hopelessness going
Yes.
on that
Yeah.
eat at you. And it's been said that with substance abuse, that category, that teenagers and kids and adults will put dope in their veins in the absence of hope in their brains.
Yeah.
Which I think is a very true
Yeah.
adage that goes on.
Well, honestly, one thing I want to talk about that, because one of the problems, I've talked to too many kids that think they're going to be dead by the time they're 19 or 20. So then you try to tell them, well, why don't you behave a little better in class? Why don't you get your homework in? Why don't you stop doing drugs? Why don't you stop having risky sex? Doesn't make any difference. I may be dead in 3 or 4 years.
Yep.
So
Yep.
in a way, it's like you've got to figure out a way to increase the feeling that they're going to be around. Now, the other side of that is the hopelessness. We did a study on looking at gang wannabes, kids in an inner city school that wanted to be gang members. We compared them based on a kind of a measure that they took that said, yeah, I would like to join a gang. They weren't in gangs yet, but they were teasing with it. Compared them to a group of kids that didn't have that attitude. The kids that wanted to be gang members felt they had absolutely no impact on anywhere in their environment. They couldn't influence what happened at home, what happened at school, what happened with their peer groups. They were totally feeling of hopelessness about being able to influence. And that actually explains why some studies indicate that joining a gang increases your self-esteem.
Yes.
Because you join the gang,
Yes.
and now you've
Yep.
got somebody to back you up, and you don't feel quite as hopeless. And eventually it transfers to you if you make your mark in that gang.
Neurological studies are looking at how the brain is impacted by self-esteem or low self-esteem. It's also looking at what some neuroscientists refer to as basic needs. Self-esteem is one that some people, there's a broad range of basic
Sure,
needs depending
yeah.
on who you read. The other two that neuroscientists are looking at is the control factor. Do I have control over what's
Yes.
going on around me? The other one is attachment. Do I have attachment?
Yeah.
And so what you're talking about is these kids who want to be. It's interesting to kind of have the researchers who are viewing this consider ways of exploring and measuring. Do the kids feel that they have control? What
Yeah.
level of control in their lives?
Yeah.
What sort of self-esteem would be another measure? And the third one would be, do they feel they have meaningful attachments with others?
Yeah.
So when we talk about community members who have the caring heart, the counselor's heart, the first step seems to me, and you've talked about this and written about this before, is having members of the community become a part of the school community, being paid to participate in the culture of the school community. And you've written about the starting point is to be a good listener.
Yeah.
And it seems that being a good listener is a way of enhancing self-esteem. Someone has taken time to
Yeah.
listen.
Yeah.
It's attachment. I'm feeling like
Yeah,
I'm
connected.
worth something here.
Yeah.
And I have some control. I can really tell what's on my mind to this person.
Yeah.
Besides the element of listening, what other skills can counselors give away in our efforts to help to build a caring community in our school?
Probably ways of confronting that have nothing to do with judgmentalness, you know? Motivational interviewing, that whole stuff that Miller has done at New Mexico, he argues that you should give advice. You should tell people, you know, people ask you a serious question, go ahead and do it. But he comes at it from a Rogerian listening
Yes.
point of view, from a framework, which
Yes.
kind of blows people's mind when they first get it, when they first come across it.
Yes.
But in effect, what he says is, use data that you know is likely the truth. If you're drinking that much, it is probably affecting you. It's going to hurt you. It's hurting your insides. You don't know it, but your organs are, you know. And if you have an enzyme level, yep, that enzyme level's high enough to say that your liver's in trouble, you know. So that finding ways to help people confront that is not my value judgment about whether you're drinking or not, but more related to the person, you know.
You know, involving communities, we worked in Nashville, Tennessee, and worked with the churches and got people who volunteered to work. And a lot of these folks were retired folks.
Yeah.
We had 3 folks who were retired as accountants. And they became responsible for doing the clerical work of scheduling to take a load off of the counselors.
Oh, that's
Not only
fantastic.
did it free up the counselors,
Yeah.
but it gave these 3 retired accountants a sense of meaning and purpose and connection
Yes.
with kids that they don't normally have.
Yeah.
Now, you've also, you know, with all of this time and energy that's going into address the needs of at-risk communities in schools, takes money.
Yep.
And there have been and continue to be continued cutbacks in terms of federal funding for education at all levels.
Yeah.
That issue seems to go unaddressed by many parents, by many students, by many teachers as they're doing their day-to-day.
Yeah.
One of the controversial issues that come up in the social justice multicultural movement is the importance of training counselors to understand basic economic policies and their impact on the mental health of individuals.
Yeah.
You have an interesting perspective about that being a taboo, those sort of discussions in schools. And you seem to have some practical ways of overcoming the taboo in practical ways. Could you talk a little bit about your thoughts about, is it appropriate for counselors to talk about economics? You can't talk about economics without political discussion.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
What's your view on that?
Well, I think what you need to do is to present the data. If you look at what's happened in this country since '08, at the beginning of the Great Recession, all right, the whole shift, there's a huge shift of money. It was bad enough in '08, but there's been a huge shift of money since then, where you end up with the top 1 and 3 and 10% of the people in this country getting richer and richer and richer. The poor getting poorer and poorer, not because they're losing any more money than they had, but programs are being cut. And the middle class is slightly falling off. It's also losing. Now, the only way you can rectify that is that you have to figure out a taxing system that can take money from people that really don't need any more and distribute that a little bit more equitably. And you can do that by just telling students aren't dumb. If you show them a chart that says the 1% made this much in this last year, and the middle class made this much in last year, and the lower class made this much last year, they can figure out it's unequitable.
And teenagers, especially in high schools, and even some elementary school kids can say, well, that's not fair. What can we do about that?
Yeah.
So now introducing the notion of what is taxation all about, what do taxes serve, and how does the tax system work in developmentally appropriate terms would seem to help educate from a public school system.
Yeah, and I would tell the teacher or counselor doing that, watch your back, because there could be a backlash on it. Don't be surprised by it, and in fact, find some way to welcome it.
Now, a little earlier in our conversations, you had an excellent point about watch your back, and you gave one practical suggestion that counselors who are committed to looking at economic injustice by teaching kids about economic injustice. You had a very good comment what not to do. Do you remember talking about that, about not naming names so much?
Oh, yeah. It seems inappropriate. What we're talking about is a collective view of the way the world operates. It comes more out of multicultural than it does in our white individualistic culture. But trying to broaden that and being careful that you don't pick on people. You don't name specific names of people as a kind of a put down. Because in some ways, this was said about the white slave owners in the South during the Civil War, that they were as harmed by slavery as the slaves were harmed. It's just it was camouflaged by all of the trappings that wealth gave them.
Interesting.
So in a certain sense, these people aren't living terribly happy lives. They just are. You can't live a happy life if you're terribly selfish, and a lot of them are selfish.
But you really make an impression on me that when we're talking about economics, the taboo subjects, racism, we're talking about classism or ableism, the whole point is to talk about systems of privilege. And we can do that by developmentally appropriate language in upper elementary, certainly high school, but not pointing to a political party or a politician here, because you're inviting blowback. But if you keep to systems analysis,
that's right,
that's developmentally appropriate, we're really doing a service to our kids who will be the next generation of leaders. Before we wrap up today, and you're thinking we've covered a lot of territory, what would you like to leave the viewers of this video to keep in mind when we're talking about shifting the idea from at-risk youth to at-risk systems, families, schools? What would be your hope that the listeners would take with them and maybe implement in their own practices?
Well, I think the first issue is that they've got to continue to work on feeling like it can get better, that there is hope out there. Because otherwise you end up getting discouraged, you get apathetic, and you fit where many of our kids are, basically, in that. So it's sort of keeping that thing alive, as you will. And I tell my counselors when they graduate, you want to go out and do well. I mean, you should go out and do well, but you also should be doing good. So go out and do well and do good.
Very simple message, very important message. Well, for all of your contributions to the field, Jeff, for the work your family is doing, and for your upcoming edition of the book, which I understand is going to have a lot of useful technological resources for kids in elementary and high school.
We're hoping so.
It's really a pace-setting book, always has been, and we'll look forward to it when it comes out in the next few months.
Great, Michael.
Thanks so much for the time.
Good talking to you.